Hola, muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Es un placer darles la
Good
bienvenida.
morning. Welcome to this press conference in which we will launch the regional strategy on labor migration and human mobility to 2030. This strategy is the result of a productive social dialogue with the participation and contribution of the governments, employers' organizations, and workers' organizations of 37 countries and territories of Latin America and the Caribbean. It's important to highlight that this strategy supplements the action priorities of the ILO in our region, together with issues such as formalization, care, and prevention and eradication of child labor. Before we start on the topic of this conference, let me explain some practical issues. The session will be distributed in two sections. The first section, we will have general presentations on the components and main characteristics of the strategy. And in the second moment, we will answer questions that we have received from the national and international means of communication. Also, during the event, you can send us your questions. In the lower part of your device, you have a Q&A icon where you can write your questions, also giving your name and identifying the organization you belong to. This conference has simultaneous interpretation services into English and Portuguese that you can also activate in the lower part of your device, selecting the language of your preference. Also, I wish to welcome all those individuals who have joined this transmission live through our YouTube channel. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Now, to get into the main topic, it's a pleasure to have with us Ana Virginia Moreira. Ana Virginia Moreira is the regional director of the ILO for Latin America and the Caribbean. And in the first part, she will give us a general overview of labor migration and the main aspects of this strategy. A pleasure to have you, Ana Virginia. Thank you, Maria. Good morning. Thank you for your interest in knowing the regional strategy that responds to the migratory movements in Latin America and the Caribbean in its labor aspects. So this strategy that we have developed with the ILO constituents, the governments, the employees' organizations, and workers' organizations, seeks to respond to the needs of the 5.9 million migrant workers living in Latin America and the Caribbean, and who represent 2% of the 313 million workers in the region. The strategy has been based on the latest ILO estimates, which are for 2021. And we anticipate that in December, we will publish the new global figures. In the image, you can see the complexity of migration flows, and thus most of the movements are within the region. These movements are volatile and complex. A striking feature is that 40% of the migrant workers in the region are women, a number that is increasing and shows the feminization of migration. These women who increasingly migrate on their own rather than as part of a family unit require differentiated responses. And the ILO's regional strategy, therefore, places special emphasis on them. United Nations data show that in the last 15 years, the migrant population in Latin America and the Caribbean has doubled from 7 to 15 million. This is the region in the world where migration has grown the most. Taking into account that around 70% of migrants work, We believe that in the figures that we will present this coming December, we will also see a strong increase in labor migration. In such a dynamic and changing landscape, getting a job is a necessity for all people, especially for migrants. It is not just any job, but it should be under decent working conditions. And that is why the strategy prioritizes the principles of a fair recruitment. Applying them is a way to guarantee the labor rights of workers, be they migrants or nationals on the one hand. And on the other hand, it also ensures that the private sector meets its needs for skilled labor and that governments enforce their respective laws. Therefore, fair recruitment is a central focus. And to advance these principles, the ILO has a global initiative underway, the so-called Fair Recruitment Initiative, to which the United States joined last week to give renewed impetus to the protection of labor rights at home and around the world. Failure to apply fair recruitment can lead, in the most extreme cases, to forced labor. And this is precisely one of the greatest risks for migrant workers. In fact, a migrant is 3 times more likely to be a victim of forced labor than a non-migrant. In a recent report of the ILO, it says that it generates legal profits of $37 billion. And this figure, just to give you an idea, is almost the GDP of Paraguay. 73% of these illegal profits come from forced sexual exploitation, the main victims of which are women, girls, and adolescents. On the other side, on the side of the benefits of labor migration for the development of countries, we can mention that migrants fill labor shortages that the countries themselves cannot fill. They also pay taxes and contribute to Social Security when they can formalize. And they also add to the social and cultural wealth of the countries that host them. This just to give a few examples. They also contribute to the development of their communities, and sending remittances is one way of doing this. A few weeks ago, the Inter-American Development Bank published that in 2023, the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean received about $155 billion. This represents a growth of 9.5% over 2022, and that for 15 consecutive years, the receipt of remittances has been increasing. In this presentation, I have highlighted only a few aspects related to labor migration. In any case, as is obvious, labor is the backbone of migration, and migration issues also permeate all aspects of labor. And in order to unite and articulate all regional efforts related to migration, the ILO, together with governments, employers, and workers of the countries and territories of Latin America and the Caribbean, have created this regional strategy on labor, migration, and human mobility until 2030. I am convinced that this is a great instrument of the ILO in a significant contribution to address the great challenges and at the same time maximize the enormous opportunities of labor migration. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ana Virginia, for this presentation in which you have shared the alignment between the regional strategy on labor migration and human mobility with the aspects of the labor world and also aspects of that represent a challenge for sustainable development in our countries. And to know the characteristics and specific components of this strategy, I welcome Francesco Carella. He's the regional expert of the ILO on labor migration and human mobility. Francesco, you have the floor to share more specific aspects of this strategy. It's a pleasure to have you with us. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maria, and good morning or good afternoon, all those of you who are participating in this press conference. Well, this regional strategy, as already mentioned by our regional director, was developed by the ILO together with its constituents. And how did I do it? Well, we did it especially through three meetings in three subregions. One, a tripartite meeting in San Jose, Costa Rica in November 2022 for the Central American countries, Mexico and the Dominican Republic. A second moment for the English speaking and Dutch speaking Caribbean countries in May 2023 in a session devoted to the labor migration strategy within the meeting of labor ministers of the Caribbean, in which we had participants from the employers and workers sector. And thirdly, a tripartite meeting for South America held in Lima, Peru in September 2023. The strategy that's now that we know the general overview, let's talk about the content of the strategy, which has five thematic areas. They tell us what is it that we are going to do. How do we propose the strategy, and how will the ILO ensure a migration that will respect the rights of the workers, including migrant workers, and that responds to the needs of employers in the private sector and the policies of the countries. So the strategy has five thematic areas, each of which has its objectives. And as ILO, we propose that all our actions will revolve around these objectives up until 2030. In the first thematic area, we have the governance of labor migration and policy coherence. The objectives of this area is to strengthen the laws and public policies of the region regarding this issue. Amongst the various priorities in this thematic area, I would highlight the strengthening of spaces for social dialogue amongst the governments, workers, and employers on labor migration, and also the strengthening of interministerial work between the ministries of foreign affairs on the one hand and the ministries of labor, security, or the interior, women, in order to improve the governance of migration and thus ensure the labor rights responding to the needs of labor markets. The second thematic area is on fair recruitment, already mentioned by our regional director. The purpose here is to improve the capabilities in the countries in order to move on in the application of the principles and guidelines of the ILO for fair recruitment. Amongst the different priorities, we have to promote the necessary legal reforms so that labor intermediation services will promote fair recruitment, which should include strong gender focus, responding to the specific needs of migrant and refugee women, and also the strengthening of national employment services to improve their services to migrants and refugees, to improve the surveillance of violations in recruitment, also promoting labor inspection, especially for migrants and refugee workers working in areas such as domestic work of difficult regions. Another priority is to give access to labor rights in terms of recruitment, including access to justice and means of remedy. The third area has to do with access to employment and improvement of labor conditions. The objective in this case is to promote public policies for the creation of employment and reduction of informality in labor migration, and to facilitate access of migrants and refugees to decent work. Amongst the various priorities in this thematic area, we have to support labor formalization of paid employees and the regularization of enterprises in order to reduce informality in uh, independent workers. And this is related to the regional strategy of the ILO related to formalization, also known as FORLAC 2. Another priority is to improve access of migrant workers and refugees to labor justice and legal institutions such as ordinary uh, courts and also non-judiciary institutions that provide arbitration and other services. Another priority is to reinforce the protection of childhood and adolescents in migration. We heard from our regional director how important forced labor is its prevention in this strategy, and the same applies to the eradication of child labor, with special attention to minors that are not accompanied, migrants that are not accompanied, and sectors that are especially vulnerable, such as domestic work.
Here we see another important link, which is with the regional initiative for Latin America and the Caribbean. Free of this, another aim is to promote freedom for migrant and refugees workers together with their representation and organization. The fourth thematic area is labor mobility training, certification, and recognition of skills, including prior learning. The purpose here is to strengthen governments, employers, and unions to promote measures to favor labor mobility, training, certification, recognition of skills, and prior learning in human mobility. Amongst the priorities, we have to promote social and economic insertion of migrant and refugee workers, amongst others, through the simplification of paperwork, the standardization of recognition of certifications, labor intermediation, competencies and skills, and reinforcement of migrant networks, and then strengthening dialogue with labor and employers organizations to determine the needs of labor and the occupational formation of countries, support professional training so that they may be in accordance to the demand and that they may attract women in order for them to get occupations that are not only considered traditional for them. Another example is the strengthening of cooperation between two or more countries in order to establish bilateral or multilateral agreements on labor mobility. And the last thematic is related to social protection and cohesion, where the purpose is to improve public policies and systems of social protection so that they may include migrant workers and refugees. Amongst other priorities, we have promotion of financial inclusion, access to credit programs for migrant and refugee workers, the establishment of multilateral and unilateral agreements on social security so that workers may transfer services and rights acquired in the third country to a country of origin or a third country, and then fix social protection to guarantee access to essential health services and basic social protection for everybody, and strengthen the work of civil society to improve social protection and prevent racism and xenophobia. Well, there is a lot encapsulated in these five thematic areas, but at least we can have an idea about what we need to do, and let's see how we'll do it. And this is going to be through 4 cross-cutting approaches that the strategy has, and they are applied to each one of these thematic areas. The cross-cutting approach number 1 is knowledge management and training. The purpose is to improve the skills to get statistics and data on labor, migration, and mobility for the decision-making processes in public policies. For example, some priorities here are to improve coordination, to harmonize methodologies and statistics on labor migration within each country and amongst the countries in the region. Also promote the use of new information technologies and the mass analysis of data, like, for example, big data. The cross-cutting approach number 2 is on strengthening of skills or capacity building partnerships and development cooperation. The purpose here is to strengthen technical skills and expand cooperation with other areas to include mobility. Some priorities include to develop strategies for the mobilization of resources, including South-South cooperation, trust funds, and the private-public partnerships. Another priority I would like to highlight is the strengthening of consultative spaces at the regional, international areas, such as the network of the UN for migration, South American Conference on Migrations, and so on. This is in order to facilitate the participation of the actors in the labor world into this, such as labor organizations and ministries of labor. Third cross-cutting approach is the implementation and promotion of international labor standards. You know that a specialized UN agency, in addition to tripartism, something that characterizes us is the regulatory approach. So with this cross-cutting approach, we can support the harmonization of laws in favor of migrant and refugee workers, also promoting their application. Amongst other priorities, I mentioned the increase of regional cooperation to face the challenges of migration and regulate it, because it's very prominent in our region, and turn it into a safer and more organized action, preventing at the same time a crime such as forced labor and human trafficking. And finally, last but not least, that is, the fourth cross-cutting approach is gender-based and intersectional approach. The purpose is to include the gender approach, the intersectional approach, in the work with migrant and refugee workers. I would like to highlight the priority to adopt measures to reduce gender gaps between migrant and refugee workers in terms of education, labor equality, including informality, access to top positions, including remuneration, and taking into account the care economy, care work, and issues of violence and harassment, which is a priority for the ILO. And also to promote laws and policies that acknowledge the need to go beyond the binary concept of gender equality, to have a better reflection of the multiple ways of discrimination, intersectionality that has a specific impact on the flow of migrant and refugee workers, and then statistics and other institutions can be helped so that they may be disaggregated by sex, occupation, which would possibly make it possible to have a comparative analysis in order to have true identification of gender gaps in access to employment amongst others. So I would leave it there for the time being. Maria, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Francesca, for the effort, for the pedagogic aspect to bring here such a complex aspects, giving us specific examples and taking into account the spread of these 5 thematic areas and 4 cross-cutting approaches, we can also understand that the regional strategy on labor migration and human mobility are characterized by a flexible approach. So for all these characteristics that Ana Virginia and Francesco mentioned on labor movements and migration movements that are so dynamic and volatile that can be adapted. So now let's start with our second block, where we will answer the questions that we have received from the national and international media. Could you help me now to get question number 1? This is the first question that will answer Ana Virginia, Regional Director. Ana Virginia, the question from La Prensa is, what measures does the ILO recommend to regionalize displaced women, migrant workers from many countries? It's been shown that one of the most effective measures to limit irregular migration, as mentioned by Francesco, is to open legal media for migration, including channels for labor migration, because as we have repeated, the surge for employment opportunities is the main reason to migrate in our region and in the world. For one a migrant worker to go to a host country, a shelter country, is to regularize and have access to employment is the first condition. Many studies on the economic impact on migrants in developing countries show how much they contribute when they are inserted into formal economy with direct contribution to tax forms, like with direct taxes and contributions to the social security systems, for example. In response, the regional strategy bets on the bilateral and regional cooperation and on having formal agreements such as the bilateral agreements on labor migration, taking into account the emerging needs, for example, due to a certain crisis situation. Bilateral agreements, such as the ones existing between Mexico and Canada for agricultural work, or between Costa Rica and Panama for the harvest of coffee, and the temporary status for the protection of Venezuelan migrants developed by Colombia. Those are just some examples of measures that the states can adopt. Thank you very much, Ana Virginia, for answering this question. We also have a second question coming from the Voice of America. This question, Francesco will help us. Francesco, the question is, does the ILO have, sorry, I missed the question. Where's the question? Yes, there it is. Does the ILO have concrete data on how the labor force of Venezuelan, Ecuadorian, and Haitian people move towards the north? Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Nestor Aguilera, for your question. Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that the ILO uses official data sources from the member states, and that is why the strengthening of the institutions that produce, collect, and analyze data on labor markets, including labor migration, is a priority for the ILO. And the idea is for these institutions to be able to generate and analyze reliable and updated data on a permanent basis. So when I presented the strategy, if you may recall, I said that the first cross-cutting approach of the strategy is related to knowledge management in order to improve the capacities of the skills in the region to get data and statistics on labor migration for their decision making. So what we do there is to work on the National Statistics Institutes, the labor market observatories, the migration observatories, and other similar institutions in order to strengthen their abilities to collect statistical and administrative data. Now, just by way of an example, amongst the three nationalities mentioned in your question, I think that the nationality for which we have more complete data are Venezuelan migrants and refugees in the region, because the UN system created a collaborative platform called Response for Venezuelans that includes more than 200 UN actors, NGOs, and others. And amongst other functions, this platform collects and compiles official data from the countries. We know that now in Latin America and the Caribbean, there are more than 6.5 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees, and more than half of them are women. These data have very important impact on the labor market. So the fact that more than half are women, and besides, women usually have higher levels of training than their men counterparts, and in many cases higher than the national women. At the same time, we notice that they have less access to labor markets, and when access is given, it is more precarious. We see that migrant and refugee women are subject to harassment through the migration in the country of destination and the place of work. Oh, in countries with migration regulation have a cost, and some families can hardly afford this cost, and this can only cover the family head, which is man, and the woman stays at home performing non-remunerated work related to care, especially, so that there is a high burden of non-remunerated work. And in the remaining time, they just go out and work informally, as that results in more precarious labor conditions with much lower wages or salaries. So the implications in terms of labor markets for those migration flows are very strong. Therefore, in our opinion, the regional strategy is justified. Thank you very much, Francesca, for your answer. Now we have question number 3, for which Ana Virginia will help us. Ana Virginia, the question is from the France Press Agency. There is this belief that migrants only get precarious jobs, poorly paid or informal jobs. Is this true in the region? Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, the evidence confirms this belief that migrant workers only have access to precarious, informal, and low salary jobs. The main reasons are the lack of migration regularization that lead them to informal employment, and the barriers for the recognition of their competencies and qualifications that do not allow them to be inserted into the labor market, and they cannot use their full potential in the economy of the country that receives them. In addition to the high informality in the labor market for all workers, the regional labor migration strategy promotes the creation and application of policies and programs for the creation of employment and reduction of informality, taking into account the special circumstances of migrant and refugee, and also the regularization of entrepreneurship for these persons to go from the informal economy to the formal economy. Thank you very much for your answer, Ana Virginia. Now we have one more question coming from TN23. The question is, how is labor migration analyzed in Guatemala and the reduction of labor in the areas of food production? Francesco, could you please help us answering this question, please? Well, first of all, I would say that traditionally, Guatemala has been a country of origin of migration, especially towards the United States and Canada, and more recently to closer countries such as Mexico and Belize, and also an in-transit country for flows towards the north. While there is a lot of unemployment in Guatemala and a lot of informal work, recently it's true that we've heard from employers of the private sector that they do not get labor or the talent they are looking for in their domestic market. And this may be due to the fact that in some of those sectors, workers may have migrated abroad. One of the sectors where we have heard this is in fact, in the agro industry and production of foodstuffs sectors. There, I would like to point out that this phenomenon is not solely seen in Guatemala, but throughout the whole region. And this is due to a lack of coherence amongst policies, in this case, between the employment policy and the migration policy. This generates distortions in the labor markets in the country of origin and in the country of destination because the supply of labor and workers is not linked to the demands in the private sector or the employer sector. In order to prevent this lack of matching between supply and demand happens, or to solve it, thematic area number 1 of the national ILO strategy insists on the importance of consistency in policies and proposes concrete measures to reach that coherence. A fundamental aspect there, additional aspect for the ILO, is to focus on the structural causes of migration.
Oportunidades de trabajo decente y las condiciones de empleo a nivel local, incluyendo en los países de origen, ¿no? Para OIT, la prioridad número 1 es y siempre
The
será
priority will always be the creation of decent work opportunities so that migration can be a choice rather than an obligation. So in other examples of concrete measures that can be taken in these cases and that we suggest in the strategy are the development of labor market information systems that what we call the CML, with information about market conditions in both countries, the national migration policies, and bilateral or multilateral agreements I mentioned before. The sectoral policies, I remember that in the case of Guatemala, approximately 4 or 5 years ago, the ILO supposes the agricultural chamber of with human rights policies that includes a chapter on fair recruitment to protect the migrant workers and workers in general, and to respond to the needs of the sector of the employers at the same time. Another measure that can be taken are strategies to expedite the recognition of skills and apprenticeships of returned migrant speakers that have come back from abroad so that they can more easily be absorbed by the labor market of the country of origin. Thank you, Francesco, because the answer also gave us concrete examples of what can be applied not only in the design of the strategy, but also in the practical life of the institutions. Now we have another question, number 5, which we received from agency France Press, Christian Sierra. How many migrants are recruited or enslaved by organized criminal gangs? Yes, since this is a crime, it is difficult to have a precise figure. It's a phenomenon that is difficult to quantify. As we mentioned, ILO studies reveal that a migrant is 3 times more likely to be a victim of forced labor than a non-migrant. And this is a big business. Illegal profits from forced labor of migrants in the world are $37 billion. Out of those $37 billion in illegal profits, 27.2 billion comes from forced commercial sexual exploitation, and $9.8 billion come from forced labor exploitation. So to prevent forced labor and human trafficking, the regional strategy on labor migration will promote prevention and care policies that give a greater visibility to these phenomena and the allocation of funds to take up the fight for their eradication. In addition, the application of ILO principles of fair recruitment throughout the recruitment process permeates the regional strategy. The ILO has a global initiative, which is the Fair Recruitment Initiative, which aims to ensure that recruitment practices at national and cross-border level are based on labor standards, are developed through social dialogue, and ensure gender equality. Just last week, I said that precisely the government of the United States announced the country's membership in the Initiatives Advisory Committee, which gives a renewed impetus to this global effort. Thank you very much, Ana Virginia, for your answer. We have received another question, which is also related to a specific country. This comes from Primicias by Monica Orozco. And Francesco Carella will help us answer this question. The question is, what challenges does Ecuador face in regarding this problem, given that it concentrates a significant amount of the migratory flow in recent years in the region, specifically from Venezuela? And Monica understands that it's the fifth country with the highest number of Venezuelan migrants in the region. Francesco. Yes, thank you very much for the question. Maybe I would start by saying that Ecuador, in addition to being a country of origin for migration and also a transit country because it's in a migrating route, has always had, at least in recent times, the reputation of being an important host country, not only for migrants, but also for refugees and people in need of international protection. It's not by chance that out of all the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ecuador that has the official name of a Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Human Mobility. That's the official name. Even before migration from Venezuela began in large numbers and before the peace accords in Colombia, Ecuador hosted a very high number, I think the highest in the Western Hemisphere, of refugees, most of whom were from Colombia. Now, regarding Venezuelan migration, I think that according to the latest official figures of the R4V platform I mentioned before, Ecuador in the last few years has ranked third, the third country that receives more migrants, now has become the fourth. The challenges facing Ecuador for social and economic integration of these people are similar to those in other countries in the Andean region and beyond in Latin America and the Caribbean. From the ILO perspective, we are more focused on the social and economic integration of these people from Venezuela and the social cohesion between these people and the host communities. And we believe that instead of in the government, the trade unions and the employers play a very special role in social economic integration, but also in the social issue, because in the daily life, these people go to work, and it's in the world of work where they live, build together with the nationals, thus promoting, in the best of cases, social cohesion. To be more specific, when we talk about issues such as socioeconomic integration, we refer to all the actions promoted by the regional strategy that the ILO is presenting today, and which include, for instance, migration, regularization, validation of the diplomas, and recognition of competencies and qualifications and knowledge in general, access to employment through fair recruitment, through public or private services, access to entrepreneurship, financial inclusion, and social protection at all levels, paying taxes or not. And for the time being, I leave it there. But for each of these items, the regional strategy gives details regarding priority actions for the countries of the region, including Ecuador. Thank you very much, Francesco, for your answer. I was taking a look at our chat, and I find that there's a question that I would like to ask you, Francesco, to answer. It comes from Reuter by Guanacaste and says as follows. Do you have data as to what are the main challenges facing working migrant women? And in that respect, I would like to know if this is the first time that the gender approach is applied to a migration policy, to a strategy. Well, thank you very much for the question. Let me start with the last part. It's not the first time that the ILO incorporates the gender approach. It's rather a priority for all the work that the ILO does in other thematic areas as well, formalization, green jobs, and so on. But I do believe that it's the first time that the ILO prepares a regional labor migration strategy. So in that sense, yes, it's a first. I think that in terms of the challenges facing migrating women, I mentioned this in response to one of the first questions, but we see that they are doubly vulnerable as women and as migrants. They are victims of violence and harassment in the route and in the destination, and also the hypersexualization of the migrant women. And then an overburden of responsibilities, of care, of work, non-paid work, for the reasons I explained before, including informality. And we see that the migration experience reinforces the division of traditional work between women and men, women in domestic work and men working outside the home. In the specific case of Venezuelan women, where we have more information right now, they have a higher levels of professional training, but also higher levels of underemployment. In other words, they work in jobs for which they are overqualified. And also those that are self-employed or um, work for themselves, they can do it for many reasons, lack of access to credit, they can only have small enterprises that are not sustainable. And that there are many reasons for that, including the limited presence of support networks for these migrant women who arrive to a country where they don't know many people, lack of care services for children, and also the difficulty in registering children in schools in many countries related to the overburden of tasks. So in that sense, it's very important that the information, the data collected and analyzed, and as we said before, statistics are very important and that they are broken down by gender so that we can act as ILO those of us involved in these responses at the micro level, that is, at the level of the refugee and migrant individuals, considering their access to entrepreneurship and working conditions at the meso level in the strengthening of the institutions, ministries, statistical institutes, organizations, trade unions, and at the macro level, that is, in the change of public policies of the countries, but also at the regional level, for instance, at the regional mechanisms of consultation that I mentioned before, the regional integration mechanisms like CARICOM or ZICA, LACAM, Mercosur, and others, so that a change of policy will allow for a change in the conditions of access to work and working conditions of these people, starting with migrant women workers and refugee women, so that it can be a sustainable change, and that can only be attained with the change in the policies. Thank you very much, Francesco, for the detail in your answer that supplements the information that we've been sharing in this conference. Well, as you know, time in television is very short, so we are getting to the end of this transmission. But before, I would like to give the floor to our regional director, Ana Virginia Moreira, for a final message to close this conference. Well, thank you, Maria. Thank you, Francesco. And thank you to all of you. I think that the regional strategy of the ILO highlights this intrinsic relationship between work and migration. This is very important because labor is in all the moments of life, in the decision of seeking another destination, when you in the dream, when you get to that destination. The strategy offers the most important mechanisms that the ILO has developed in its more than 100 years of existence. The ILO was a pioneer in releasing labor and migration because of the concern regarding the human rights of migrant workers that is present since the beginning. And I would like to highlight one last aspect, in addition to the central aspects of the strategy that Francisco has explained so well: the regulatory production of the ILO, the importance of supporting the state in the production of data so that decisions can be made based on data. This strategy was built based on social dialogue processes. So it is legitimated by the governments, by the workers, and by the employers of the region. So it also means creating a space in our region for dialogue, cooperation, exchange of experiences, so that the issue of labor rights of migrant workers and refugees can move ahead and to guarantee decent work for these people. Thank you very much, Ana Virginia. And it's not only a commitment, a tripartite commitment for the creation of the strategy. We also have that same commitment for its implementation and follow-up in the achievement of the objectives proposed. And in that sense, we are convinced that we will also have the support of all the institutions that are related to this process. So this has been the press conference. We wish to thank you very much for attending all the national and international means of communication. We have some questions that we couldn't answer, but we'll do so on a bilateral basis through communication or scheduling meetings with our experts in the region and in the different countries. We also invite you to follow us through our social network so that you can make your contributions regarding the development of our work on labor migration and human mobility. Have an excellent day, and thank you very much for being with us in this event.